Welcome to the debate. We often dive into complex parts of our shared material, trying to understand different viewpoints. Today, we're looking at a really fascinating and, let's be honest, difficult story from Sefer Moses, that companion text which gives so much more depth to Genesis. Specifically, we're examining Jacob and Esau, and this whole question of divine will versus human action. Our central question today is this: was Jacob getting the birthright and Isaac's blessing through deception? Was that a justifiable way to fulfill a divine plan? Or was it a morally questionable act with some pretty serious, lasting consequences? My position is that Jacob's actions may be flawed, certainly not straightforward, were ultimately tools in God's larger plan, fulfilling prophecies and making sure the covenant line went where YHVH intended.
And I'll be taking the view that Jacob's actions, his deliberate deception, really constitute a significant moral wrong. I think it highlights the very real human cost involved and makes us question whether deceit is ever truly justified, even if you believe it's serving some perceived divine purpose. The way they went about it had, well, profound and negative impacts that we really can't just brush aside.
Right. And one way to approach this, the way I see it, is that Jacob's actions, yes, they involved cunning, definitely a detour from honesty, but they were part of a plan, orchestrated maybe from a higher level to ensure the right person got the blessing. I mean, the text even tells us this was foreshadowed, right? The angel tells Rebekah, the elder should come to serve the younger. Now, this wasn't just some, offhand prediction. It seems to have actively guided Rebekah. And remember her role. She's called a priestess of El Elyon. That's significant and implies a deep spiritual insight, perhaps prophetic understanding. So she understood this divine will, or believed she did, and then urged Jacob to carry out the plan. Her instruction seems pretty central here. And then there's Esau himself. His own actions, they consistently show he just didn't care much about this sacred inheritance. Selling his birthright for what, a bowl of stew? It shows a real lack of understanding of its spiritual value. It wasn't just about property rights, it was the covenant promises. And Sefer Moses adds that detail about the garments of Adam, these incredibly sacred relics passed down through figures like Amraphel, ending up with Esau. His willingness to just trade those away for food, well, it underlines his unsuitability for the spiritual inheritance they represented. It shows a kind of spiritual blindness, wouldn't you say? Finally, look at Isaac. His reaction is key. Yes, he's distressed initially, very distressed, but ultimately he trembles and acknowledges it was the will of Yahweh in all things. Even the father, the patriarch, recognizes, after the shock, that something bigger was at play, something overriding his own wishes. That feels like a divine stamp of approval on the outcome. And then Jacob gets the name Israel, straight to God or strives with God, and receives power.
It suggests his path, maybe winding, maybe imperfect, ultimately aligned with divine intent.
I understand the argument about divine orchestration, I do. But I find it hard to accept that the end justifies these means, especially given the very clear moral issues. Jacob's methods were, well, explicitly deceptive. That's not really up for debate, is it? They were morally problematic, regardless of the outcome. And they caused real suffering, real conflict. The text is crystal clear. Jacob repeatedly lied to his blind father Isaac. He pretended to be Esau. I mean, that's a deliberate deception, a violation of trust, manipulating an old, vulnerable parent. And Isaac's reaction. You mentioned his acknowledgement, but first comes that profound distress. He trembled very exceedingly. He says, "In my heart, I wished it not so." That's not just mild upset. It shows the sheer moral weight of what Jacob did, the deep personal pain it caused his own father. And what about Esau? His great and exceeding bitter cry, his feeling of being supplanted, cheated twice. It underscores the injustice he felt. It wasn't just about losing something he'd maybe undervalued before. It was about having the sacred blessing stolen through outright fraud. And the immediate result? Deep hatred from Esau, forcing Jacob to run for his life. That shows the immediate, concrete, negative impact on the family. Now, yes, there was a prophecy about the elder serving the younger, but does that prophecy endorse deceit as a way to make it happen? I don't see that. The text portrays the lying as a human choice. Jacob's choice, Rebekah's choice, with human consequences. Maybe the will of Yahweh refers to the eventual outcome, sure, but I don't think it retroactively makes the immoral actions okay.
I absolutely take the point about the distress. It's undeniable. But I wonder if we're also meant to see Rebekah's role here, and maybe Jacob following her lead, as a kind of courage? A difficult step, certainly, but one taken to make sure a prophecy she deeply understood came to pass. Her instruction to Jacob, it wasn't just, playing favorites. It seems rooted in that divine message she received, which put a heavy spiritual responsibility on her. As a priestess of El Elyon, maybe she felt acutely responsible for the continuation of the Abrahamic covenant through the right line which she perceived as Jacob, especially given Esau's documented indifference to spiritual things like the birthright sale. Perhaps she saw it as aligning human actions, however messy, with a divine decree, less about deceit, more about difficult obedience to a higher purpose.
Well, I appreciate framing it in terms of her prophetic role, but even a priestess, even someone with that title, isn't exempt from moral responsibility for how they act, surely? The text specifically says Jacob lied, repeatedly. There's just no hint that Yahweh commanded the deception itself or approved of it. Divine will, if we accept that's what's ultimately happening, can be fulfilled in many ways. Choosing deceit over honesty, well, that's still a moral failing, and it had clear consequences. Think about Jacob having to flee, his fear of Esau years later when they meet again. That doesn't sound like someone acting confidently on divine orders, does it? It sounds like someone dealing with the fallout of their own questionable choices. If the means were divinely sanctioned, why all the fear, the separation, the incredibly tense reunion? It seems more likely the will of Yahweh worked despite the human flaws, not because of them. The outcome might be divine, but the path taken was deeply human and flawed. And building on that, the actual legitimacy of the blessing feels shaky, doesn't it? It was obtained under completely false pretenses. Jacob misrepresented who he was to his blind father. That sacred act, the patriarchal blessing which should be given freely with full knowledge, it feels undermined by that manipulation. Okay, maybe Esau was reckless about his birthright earlier, fine, but Jacob's cunning exploitation, first his brother's hunger, then his father's blindness and infirmity, it paints a picture of, well, self-serving behavior, doesn't it? Esau's cry isn't just frustration, it's a profound sense of being robbed, of injustice. He felt something sacred was stolen from him, whatever his earlier mistakes. How can we really call a blessing legitimate when it's obtained like that?
Okay, I hear the point about the pain and the sense of theft, but let's also look closely at the textual evidence suggesting Esau's own actions really paved the way for this. Maybe they even, in a way, justified the shift. Esau made himself unworthy of that sacred inheritance long before Jacob put on the goatskins. Selling the birthright for stew, that clearly shows his disregard for the spiritual weight it carried. It wasn't just a bad deal, it was dismissing his unique covenantal place. And then that detail about the garments of Adam, trading those away, these weren't just any clothes, they were relics symbolizing potentially humanity's original connection to the divine, a symbol of authority. Trading them shows again this profound spiritual blindness, confirming his unsuitability. And the text, Sefer Moses, it even says these garments were given back into the hands of the descendants of Shem through Jacob. That sounds less like theft and more like a restoration of divine order, putting things back where they belonged. And back to Isaac, his eventual statement, "Indeed he shall be blessed, for this was the will of YHVH in all things." Doesn't that retroactively validate the transfer? It suggests YHVH's ultimate plan overrode the messy human details. And let's not forget, Isaac also gives Jacob the keys of the kingdom of heaven, a powerful metaphor for spiritual authority. That really signifies divine approval for Jacob's role, not just a reluctant acceptance of a bad situation. Doesn't all this point towards YHVH working through imperfect people, flawed situations to achieve a higher, maybe even predestined outcome?
And really, the long-term results, I think, offer strong support for divine approval. Jacob becomes Israel. That new name itself signifies someone who has struggled with God Elohim, emphasizing divine power and with humans, and has been given power.
It confirms his appointed role. He receives the endowment, the power passed down from Abraham and Isaac. His descendants are promised to be like the stars, the sand, the core of the covenant blessings, through whom all nations would eventually be blessed. Now, the conflict with Esau, yes, it was painful, deeply so. But eventually, years later, they do reconcile. It's cautious, yes, but it's peaceful. Doesn't that demonstrate that divine grace can work through these things, can mitigate human conflicts, weaving even our flaws into a bigger picture of redemption and purpose? The final result, the covenant flourishing through Jacob, seems to validate the divine hand driving these events.
That's a fair point about the ultimate outcome and the covenant continuing, but I still wonder if we're smoothing over the human cost too quickly. The immediate result was Esau's raw hatred, his desire to kill Jacob. That's in the text. It forced Jacob into exile for years, and the tension between their descendants, Edom and Israel, it's a constant theme later on. It suggests the deception created this deep crack, this rift that wasn't easily fixed. Okay, they reconciled years later, but how did Jacob approach that meeting? With immense fear, careful planning, loads of gifts, basically appeasement. He was terrified for his life and his family's lives. That doesn't scream fully healed relationship, does it? It suggests the scars remained. The relationship might have been patched up, but maybe it was never what it could have been without the initial deceit. So the narrative might also be teaching us that even chosen people face moral consequences.
Character flaws complicate things. They create bitterness that takes huge effort, immense caution to overcome. It wasn't just passive grace fixing everything. It required Jacob's very real fear and careful diplomacy. Doesn't that highlight the lasting impact of his deception rather than just divine mitigation?
So, summarizing my view, I still hold that Jacob's actions, yes, involving cunning, deception even, ultimately served a divine purpose. The narrative seems to point towards this orchestrated plan. You've got Rebekah's prophecy, her unique role as priestess, Esau's clear unworthiness based on his own actions, Isaac's final acknowledgement of God's will, and then Jacob becoming Israel, receiving the blessings. It all points to a kind of teleological view where the end result validates the path, even with its human complexities and imperfections. Sefer Moses, especially, seems to guide us towards seeing this not just as family drama, but as Yahweh's deeper plan unfolding.
And just to restate my position, Jacob's deliberate deception, the lying, it just can't be easily dismissed as simply an imperfect means. The text makes the moral transgression pretty clear. Jacob's lies, Isaac's physical distress, Esau's bitter reaction, and lasting resentment. These aren't side notes. They're central to the human cost of that deceit, the family breakdown it caused. So, yes, the divine outcome was achieved. The covenant went through Jacob. But the story also feels like a powerful warning, showing that our choices, especially morally compromised ones, have real, lasting consequences. They complicate even a promised destiny and create ripples that last for generations. We're left wrestling with that tension, between destiny and our own responsibility for how we act.
Absolutely. Both viewpoints really offer valuable ways into this pivotal and, let's face it, challenging narrative. It reminds us how many layers these texts have. We've looked at how Jacob's deception can be seen either as sort of divinely guided fulfillment of prophecy using flawed human tools, or as a morally compromising act with some very real, lasting fallout for everyone.
Exactly. The material really leaves us thinking about that complex dance between divine purpose and human free will, human agency. Is the idea that Yahweh works through everything, even our mistakes, to reach a higher goal? Or is it emphasizing how crucial integrity really is, that how we achieve something matters, even if the destination is promised? Does the method taint the result?
The story of Jacob and Esau, the blessing, it really forces us to grapple with these big questions about faith, morality, divine intervention, and how they all interact. There's definitely much more to unpack in this rich material, and we hope this discussion encourages you to keep exploring it.